Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting in this subject. But, anyways, of course, for those of you that, of course, for those of you that know my channel, you know that a lot of the times I like to review certain videos, not only to get my perspective out there, but to get other people's perspective out there as well. Well, one channel that I've been recently reviewing as of late has been Mr. Johnboxing P4P the best, because I think that he brings up certain points that, in my view, can be somewhat relevant. But at the same time, I also do believe that he is somewhat racially and emotionally motivated, which of course leads to certain debates that, in my view, would not quite be as logical, or at least overall wouldn't be quite, as valid as what some people overall may think it is. At least once originally they see it on the surface. But of course, one of the debates that many people, including Mr. John Boxing Pound for Pound the Best, one thing, of course, that they have tried to debate is that, Terence Bud Crawford, that he is the undisputed best fighter of this era. And of course, if you wanted to debate that, you certainly have a debate for that because Crawford, of course, is an undefeated fighter. He's now a four-weight division champion. He had the most dominant performance, at least debatably, for a great fighter of this era over, a counterpart fighter. When I say counterpart fighter, I'm talking about a fight that was looked at as a 50-50 level fight heading into it. Of course, I guess that's up there with Mr. Naoya Inoue in the Steve Von Fulton fight, but of course, a lot of people, including myself, would probably debate that Spence was of higher quality. But it's very hard, in my view, to really pinpoint who is the undisputed number one pound for pound fighter of this era. Once again, in my view, you have about three or four fighters that you can throw their name into that hat. You have that of Terence Bud Crawford, you have that of Canelo Alvarez, you have that of Alexander Usyk, and of course you have that of the Japanese monster, Mr. Naoya Inoue. But all four of those fighters, in my view, they kind of have a great debate. I would especially say the first three, Usyk, Canelo Alvarez, and Crawford, that they have the best debate because they're probably the most experienced and the most proven of the past decade. But the thing is that, of course, when we talk about the sport of boxing, it's a little bit harder to rank because when you talk about a lot of the rankings, a lot of it is a little bit more subjective, even compared to that of other sports because of course the most thing overall that is going to be the least quantifiable is going to be that of the quote unquote resume. And that's why I kind of came here today, because we do have to come up with a criteria, because a lot of people, from what I notice, whenever it comes to certain fighters that they want to promote, they love to do this stuff where they love to say that this guy beat this guy and he beat this A grade level fighter and this former champion. But then when it comes to another fighter that maybe did similar things, they love to all of a sudden state that that guy was out of their prime and that he wasn't at their best anymore, but they won't do that same standard with their favorite fighters. So once again, the point is of this video is what actually quantifies someone being a quote unquote A grade level fighter. Because in my personal view, just because the fighter is not in their absolute peak or in their absolute prime doesn't necessarily mean that they still were not a great or an absolutely, great fighter or still an A grade level fighter. Because, for example, when Alexander Vosdick ended up defeating Adonis Stevenson, Adonis Stevenson, of course, was older. I believe that he was in his late 30s, but he still was the WBC champion and still a very dangerous fighter. Now, was he at the absolute peak of his powers as what he once was? No, probably not. Maybe not even in his absolute prime, but still an A-grade level win that Alexander Vosdick was able to get over that of an Adonis Stevenson. When Tyson Fury was able to defeat that of a Vladimir Klitschko, when Klitschko, I believe, was about 37 to 38 years old, or somewhere around there. When Tyson Fury was able to defeat him, sure, he was a little bit older, and maybe if you even want to state that Klitschko was not at the absolute peak of his powers anymore, that would probably be somewhat of a correct statement. But to just state that Klitschko would be quote unquote washed up, in my personal view, or that that win just has no value, I just can't agree with that. Or for example, even here, when you take a look at the Mayweather versus Canelo Alvarez, fight, Mayweather was very dominant over Canelo Alvarez. I don't think that Canelo Alvarez was at the absolute peak of his powers yet, because I don't think that he had as much great opponents on his resume as what a Floyd Mayweather Jr. did. And I think that I do think that that was a slight factor, overall in that fight. That isn't the main reason why I think Floyd won that fight, but I do think that it was a factor. So once again, we have to quantify what is an A grade level win and what isn't, because a lot of people love to do this to discredit a certain fighter, when they want to try and make it seem like their resume is worse than what it actually is. But then when it comes to their favorite fighter, they want to boost it up and make it better than what it actually is. And one thing that I've noticed from a lot of these channels is that they want to try and make Terence Bud Crawford's resume look that much greater than what it actually is. And listen, if we are going to go off of who is the greatest fighter of this era, Once again, I think it's between Usyk, Crawford, and that of Canelo Alvarez. But when you talk about who has the greatest resume of this era, in my view, in terms of quantifiable evidence, I don't really think that it's debatable. I think that Canelo Alvarez has clearly the greatest resume of this era, and I don't think that it's relatively close. But we're going to talk about that as the video goes along. But anyways, I'm not going to try to make this video as long as possible. I'm only going to make this probably about 20 to 25 minutes. But I just wanted to talk about this because this has been a debate that's been going on now for a very long time. But let's see overall what Mr. Johnboxing Pound for Pound the Best has to say.
Okay. Now, one thing that I keep hearing, right? I keep hearing this narrative about how Canelo Alvarez has this loaded resume, this deep rooted resume, and I'm gonna piss a lot of people off with this. I don't think Canelo Alvarez, in terms of who he's beaten, I don't think Canelo Alvarez has a loaded resume. I think his resume is a bit overrated because he doesn't really have a victory over anyone that was in their primes. He's beaten a lot of guys who were out.
And I'm glad that Johnboxing Pound for Pound the Best stated this because this needs to be addressed. Because this is what a lot of these LDBC and new media channels do in order overall, once again, to discredit Canelo Alvarez. And, people always do this with certain fighters that, they want to discredit or want to disprove. But at the end of the day, what once again classifies as someone being quote unquote in their prime? Because if we really want to talk about it with this fight, for example, Canelo Alvarez was not at his absolute peak when he fought Floyd Mayweather Jr. He wasn't at his absolute peak. So once again, what quantifies as someone being in their quote unquote prime?
Their primes. And I think his best win was against Triple G the second time. And Triple G was in his mid-30s when Canelo beat him the second time. I don't think Canelo beat him the first time. I don't think Canelo
Alvarez beat Gennady Golovkin in the first fight either. But once again, just because someone is 36 years old, does that really mean that they're not at the absolute peak of their powers and not quote unquote in their prime? So once again, what quantifies that? Because are we using these same standards with Terence Bud Crawford? Because when Terence Bud Crawford overall fought certain fighters, overall you could debate that they were not in their quote unquote prime or at the absolute peak of their powers. But we're going to talk about that as the video goes along.
Beat him the second time. Canelo's second best win will be Miguel Cotto. Miguel Cotto was out of his primes. Daniel Jacobs was out of his primes.
No, Daniel Jacobs was not out of his prime. Daniel Jacobs overall was in his early 30s, I believe, or around there. And on top of that, he was coming off the win over Sergey Derevyanchenko. And his only recent loss was against Gennady Golovkin, who was looked at as one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters. And that was a very, very, very competitive fight. So no, Danny Jacobs was not out of his prime. That's a lie. It is what it is. Now, when you want to talk about Miguel Cotto being out of his prime, you can say that if you want to. But Miguel Cotto, once again, was looked at as a refurbished fighter. And this is also the thing that I'm going to state. There's a difference between an A-grade level fighter that is maybe not at the absolute peak of his powers anymore, but still an A-grade level win and a great win, like the fighters that I mentioned earlier. Or, for example, when Haney defeated that of Vasily Lomachenko. Someone that still is a great fighter, but maybe not at the absolute peak of his powers anymore because he's a little bit older or a little bit more aged or not in a weight class that he probably belongs, and someone that is completely washed up. like when Kell Brook and Amir Khan fought Terence Bud Crawford, for example, those guys were done. No one ever took a look at those guys as championship level caliber fighters ever again. That's how you know those guys were washed up. They had no chance at actually winning any legitimate titles in any of their weight classes at that point. They were done.
Sergey Kovalev was so far out of his prime. So these guys were in their mid to late 30s, the guys that Canelo beat. And as far as Floyd, listen.
Well, here's the question that I have to ask you, Mr. Johnboxing Pound for Pound the Best. If we're going to go off of those standards, when we take a look at Mr. Terence Bud Crawford's resume, let's take a look at his resume very quickly. Because when we talk about the 5 or the 7 biggest wins of his career, or most notable names in his career, we're talking about Yuriorkis Gamboa. We're talking about Victor Postol. We're talking about Sean Porter. We're talking about Errol Spence Jr. We're talking about Israel Madrimov. Those are really the only 5 A-grade level wins, in my view, that you can debate in Terence Bud Crawford's career. Now, some people, of course, would say Kell Brook, and some people would say some would say Kell Brook, and some would say Amir Khan. I do not count either of those wins at that point in time A-grade level wins, and I'm going to state why. But once again, if we're going to state this stuff about Canelo Alvarez, once again, does not fight these guys in their prime, well, listen, these are the facts of the situation, whether people want to admit it or not. And this is why, once again, we have to start coming up with the criteria of what is an A grade level win and what isn't. Because the facts of the matter and the facts of the situation is this. When Terence Bud Crawford fought that of a Yuriorkis Gamboa, if we really want to nitpick, Yuriorkis Gamboa, first of all, never really belonged in that weight class of 135. He never really belonged there in the first place. And on top of that, he was off for a year. So if we're going to use these excuses once again for Canelo, for Jamel Charlo and all this other stuff, oh, these guys, they're moving up a weight class and, they were off for a year, no problem, but then start using it with everybody. Because Crawford did not fight Gamboa when he was relatively active, and Gamboa was giving Terence Bud Crawford everything that he can handle in that fight, by the way. So it is what it is. A guy that was a decent amount smaller and a guy that was not really a great defensive fighter. But that being stated, do I believe that Crawford got better as a fighter later on in his career? Absolutely, yes, I do. Same with Canelo Alvarez. But the thing is with a lot of these channels is that they want you to believe that Canelo Alvarez has never ever adjusted or gotten greater as a fighter, which of course is not the case. But it is what it is. But anyways, when you talk about it, Terence Bud Crawford, after that, he fought Victor Postal. That probably is the purest win of his career. When you talk about, a fighter being active and on top of that, natural for that weight class, great win. And then, of course, if you want to talk about the Sean Porter win, Sean Porter, it's not like Sean Porter was a champion at that time. So does that mean that Sean Porter was out of his primes? Does that mean that Sean Porter was not an A grade level fighter at that time because he had already lost 3 times and he was no longer a champion by the time that Terence Bud Crawford had fought him? It's not like he fought the Sean Porter that Kell Brook or what Keith Thurman or Errol Spence Jr. did, because when Spence and Kell Brook fought him, he was a champion. Terence Bud Crawford didn't fight Sean Porter as a champion. All right? So it is what it is. So are we going to bring up that point, Mr. Johnboxing? Later on, of course, he fought Errol Spence Jr. Spence was off for about 14 months. Are we going to mention that, sir? And on top of that, all the car accidents. So was Errol Spence Jr. 100% in his absolute prime? Was he in his absolute prime? If we're going to use that excuse, and then of course, Mr. Israel Madrimov. Madrimov really only has about 11 total fights on his record. How good do we know that guy actually is? He has no experience against any elite caliber opponents. So if we're really going to go there, we can try to use these excuses all we want to. But if we're going to keep the same standards overall, once again, all those guys, in my view, were A-grade level fighters. When we bring up Kell Brook and Amir Khan, those guys were done. They were dog meat. Those guys were done. Kell Brook was already stopped in brutal fashion in 2 separate fights. He was never the same after the Errol Spence Jr. fight. The last shred of greatness that Kell Brook had was against that of an Errol Spence Jr. And everything after that, he was never the same fighter ever again. Amir Khan, after he got knocked out by Canelo Alvarez, never the same fighter ever again. Now, this is the thing. We can state that Canelo Alvarez, once again, that, he fought this guy a little bit later and blah, blah, blah. But what is not arguable is that how those fighters were looked at when Canelo Alvarez fought them. And when he fought Gennady Golovkin, for example, there's 11 A-grade wins, in my view, in Canelo Alvarez's career. When he fought that of Austin Trout was coming off of the win over Miguel Cotto. He was looked at as an A-grade level champion. When he fought Erislandy Lara was looked at as the most dangerous contender there, and Canelo fought him. Now, of course, some would debate that they thought Lara won, but at the end of the day, in my view, it was a close competitive fight that could have won either way. They gave it to Canelo Alvarez, yes, partially because he was the more marketable of the two, but also partially because it was a very close and competitive fight. So Canelo Alvarez was able to get the win over Erislandy Lara when he was looked at as his most dangerous. Then he fought Miguel Cotto, who of course had already lost a multitude of times, but had won the WBC and the Ring Magazine titles at the middleweight division. So it's not like Miguel Cotto was just this complete washed up dude like that of a Kell Brook or an Amir Khan, for example, like when Terence Bud Crawford fought those fighters. It's not like overall like that's what happened. And then afterwards, of course, he beat Gennady Golovkin in the second fight. Yes, when he was 36 years old, but when he gave Canelo Alvarez hell in the first fight, I thought Gennady won the first fight. I thought Canelo Alvarez won the rematch. Gennady was still looked at as one of the top 5 pound-per-pound fighters, and keep in mind that the fight right before the Canelo Alvarez fight, he knocked out Vanes Martirosyan within 2 rounds, a guy that Andrade, Lara, and either Charlie Butler couldn't even knock down throughout that whole entire fight. All right? So keep in mind, that's the fighter that Canelo Alvarez was able to defeat at that point in time. So, of course, he has that win over Gennady Golovkin. That's another A-grade level win. Of course, after that, he has Danny Jacobs. After Danny Jacobs was able to, I believe, win the WBC belt over Sergey Derevyanchenko, or the WBA title over Sergey Derevyanchenko. That was another A-grade level win. No, Danny Jacobs was not out of his prime. All right? It is what it is. And then after that, I believe he was able to defeat that of a Callum Smith when Callum Smith was the Ring Magazine champion. All right. And, won the Super 6 tournament there. He was then able to defeat Billy Joe Saunders when Saunders was still undefeated and looked at as a 2-weight division champion and was one of the best middleweights in the world. He was able to defeat that of Caleb Plant when Caleb Plant was looked at as one of the best super middleweights in the world and at his absolute peak and at his absolute prime. That was his 8th A grade level win. And then of course, he was able to defeat Sergey the Crusher Kovalev, when Kovalev, sure, of course, is not at his absolute peak anymore, but Kovalev, of course, was still an A-grade level fighter. At least he was coming off of 2 wins over Eleider Alvarez and Anthony Yard. 2 fighters that were 2 great top contenders within that light heavyweight class. And then, of course, he was also able to defeat Jamel Charlo when Jamel Charlo was undisputed at the 154-pound weight class, coming off of the knockout victory over Brian Gastano. Of course, after that, he was off for a year, but it is what it is. And then, of course, after that, he was able to defeat Jaime Munguia off of the best win in his career. So once again, let's not go into quote-unquote resumes because Canelo Alvarez is going to blow Terence Bud Crawford out of the water there. And once again, Kell Brook and Amir Khan, they were not great fighters when Terence Crawford had fought them.
It does not help Canelo Alvarez's legacy when you guys keep pushing this stupid narrative about Canelo being 23. You guys do realize that boxing is a young man's sport. It's a young man's sport. Canelo Alvarez had 40 plus fights when he fought Floyd. And you guys act like Floyd Mayweather was a young man when he fought Canelo. Floyd was 36. And he was a smaller fighter. Canelo Alvarez rehydrated 16 to 17 pounds on fight night. He was the younger, heavier, stronger fighter when he fought Floyd. So it doesn't help Canelo Alvarez that you guys keep bringing up the fact that Canelo was younger.
Well, this is what I'm going to state about the Canelo and Floyd Mayweather Jr. situation. And this is pretty much going to be the last part of it that I'm going to talk about because, of course, what Johnboxing debated earlier in the video is that he believes that Crawford is clearly more skilled than more skilled than Canelo because Canelo has had problems with boxers. And I get that. But that being stated, when we talk about the Austin Trout and the Lara and the Mayweather fights, and also the Bivol fights. First of all, the Trout and the Lara and the Mayweather fights, that does have to be talked about. That was very early on in Canelo Alvarez's career and when he was just starting to face elite caliber level competition, like 50-50 level fights. Those are the first times, in his career when he was really starting to face guys like that. That does have to be mentioned. So Canelo was not yet at the absolute peak of his powers during some of those fights. Now, the Dimitri Bivol fight, of course, he was at the peak of his powers there, or at least mainly. But that being stated, Canelo was legitly outsized against Dimitri Bivol. Canelo was 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach. He never belonged in that weight class in the first place. He was fighting a guy that was 6 foot. And on top of that, one of the best fighters in the world. Not someone that would have been top 10 pound per pound as of yet, but someone that probably would have been around the top 20 pound per pound range. And someone that clearly overall was very particularly dangerous. And a lot of people, of course, try to compare that to the Canelo, and Bivol fight to the Crawford and Madrimov fight. Well, it's really not that comparable because Crawford outlengthened Israel Madrimov by several inches. And on top of that, Crawford also, I believe, he's more closer to Madrimov's size than what really Canelo is to Dimitri Bivol's. Now, of course, Canelo rehydrated heavier than that of a Dimitri Bivol, I believe, or around the same size. But that was because he tried to add on a little bit of muscle mass in order to try and bully Dimitri Bivol around the ring. Of course, it didn't end up happening. But once again, that fight really isn't comparable to the Madrimov versus Crawford fight because Crawford and Madrimov, they're pretty much about even out in size. Madrimov, of course, is the girthier guy and the thicker guy when you talk about naturally at that weight class. Of course, Crawford rehydrated heavier, but that's probably because he tried to blow it up a little bit in weight in order once again to try and make his power more effective there. But it is what it is. But combined with the reach, they pretty much were about the same size. Bivol and Canelo Alvarez were not the same size, not even close. So once again, that does have to be stated there.
Canelo was the champion.
And that's why even though people want to say, well, Crawford is undefeated, Canelo Alvarez is not undefeated, so that's why we have to put Crawford over Canelo. Well, if you want to use that point, you can, and you definitely have, your perspective. And in my view, Canelo Alvarez and Crawford, that's a great debate. Usyk as well, he's right there as well. But, once again, when we talk about resume, in my view, that's really not that debatable. And that's why it's so hard for me to state that if Crawford is greater than Canelo, that is just completely unanimous because the problem is that Crawford really doesn't have close to the resume of a Canelo Alvarez, really not even near. It just is what it is. Now, of course, he has, a few great wins now, but it's just not the same amount of A-grade level wins that Canelo Alvarez has.
He was the champion at the junior middleweight division. So he fought guys who helped him gain experience.
And that's why people want to say, oh, well, the Israel Madrimov win, it's just as good as a Dmitry Bivol, just as good as a Dmitry Bivol fight. No, it's not. And that's why you have guys like Aki TV and these guys trying to claim that Madrimov would beat Canelo and that overall that Madrimov is just as good as Bivol or Gennady Golovkin. No, he's not. Because Gennady Golovkin was almost completely undisputed and had experience against a multitude of the top contenders, fighters that were actually ranked within the top 5 of that division before he fought Canelo Alvarez. All right, when you talk about, that of a Dmitry Bivol, Bivol was at least proven against some of the top contenders in that division. Sullivan Barrera, Jean Pascal, Joe Smith Jr. Israel Madrimov didn't fight any of the legitimate top 5 contenders in that division. He didn't fight Tim Tszyu. He didn't fight Virgil Ortiz. He didn't fight Sebastian Fondura. He didn't fight Brian Mendoza. He didn't fight Brian Castano. He didn't fight Jamel Charlie. He didn't fight any of those guys. So once again, we don't know how good Israel Madrimov actually is. Now, I think that he's an A-grade level fighter, but once again, he might fight Tim Tszyu next and get his ass completely kicked. We don't know. That's why I don't rank things off of hypotheticals. When you talk about the fighters that Canelo Alvarez had fought, those guys were proven A-grade level fighters. And on top of that, they were all decent champions when Canelo Alvarez fought those guys, the guys that I had mentioned.
His fight with Shane Mosley, that fight helped him gain experience. So it's not like Canelo Alvarez was fighting a bunch of tomato cans before he fought Floyd. He fought some solid guys before he fought Floyd. Mind you,
Well, you can't have it both ways, sir. We can't state this thing about how Canelo Alvarez doesn't have a whole lot of prime names on his resume and blah, 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 but apparently those names were good enough to get him prepared for the best fighter debatably of all time in Floyd Mayweather Jr. We can't have it both ways. So at the end of the day, if you're going to claim overall that that's a part of Canelo Alvarez's resume, you can state that all you want to, but then you're also going to have to not die on that hill, and you're going to have to admit overall that Canelo Alvarez, that the fight level experience was not the same as what a Floyd Mayweather Jr. had.
He fought Floyd, he had to beat somebody by the name of Austin Trout. The same Austin Trout that beat Miguel Cotto. Now, mind you, I don't think Canelo beat Trout. I thought that fight was extremely close. But
it wasn't as close as what you're remembering, sir, because I've watched that fight in recent years, because I once upon a time thought that fight was close as well. For any of us that actually know how to score a fight, that fight was really about 8-4 for Canelo Alvarez.
Canelo still beat somebody who was in their primes to get the fight with Floyd. Canelo beat somebody that had a lot of experience. Trout beat Cotto, and Canelo beat Trout. And then Canelo lost to Floyd.
Yes, but the thing is that really was the only big fight in Canelo Alvarez's career at that time. Now, of course, we can talk about the fact that he beat Sugar Shane Mosley, but Shane Mosley was pretty much done at that point in time in his career. Shane Mosley was not offering much resistance. Of course, he beat other former champions like Carlos Baldomir and, overall that of a Kermit Cintrone and, some other guys as well. But those guys were pretty much washed up as well. Pretty much was known by that.
So Canelo wasn't that inexperienced. Because 2 fights later, he fought someone that was just like Floyd Mayweather.
Well, Canelo Alvarez wasn't completely inexperienced, but what I would compare that to is a very similar situation like when Shaquille O'Neal ended up losing to Hakeem Olajuwon within that of the 1996 finals. Shaq, of course, was experienced enough to get to that of the NBA finals in 1996, and of course, he was extremely talented. But at the end of the day, it does have to be mentioned that Hakeem Olajuwon was the less wetter behind the ears when you talk about both of the fighters. Of course, the Orlando Magic probably had more talent, and, the Orlando Magic were debatably the guys that were probably supposed to win. But Shaquille O'Neal's inexperience and some of the other guys, at least when you talk about actually winning in those big-time situations, it was a factor. Shaquille O'Neal was in his prime years, but he was not at his absolute peak yet. And that's why, once again, it has to be stated that just because a fighter is not at their absolute peak, yet or even anymore, doesn't still mean that they were not an A-grade level win. And oftentimes people love to use this as an excuse in order to just detract certain resumes in order to uplift other ones. Another great example, of course, would be Patrick Mahomes right now, the best quarterback in the league, and in my view, a top 5 quarterback of all time, clearly at this point in time. Him losing to Tom Brady in the playoffs, at least that first time. Because of course, Patrick Mahomes, we can state the stuff about, well, it's a young man's game and blah, 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 right? But experience and wiliness, and that experience in big level moments is going to help. Or even Novak Djokovic defeating Carlos Alcaraz in that of the French Open or in possibly other Grand Slams. That is a potential factor. It does have to be mentioned. And I think Canelo Alvarez was in a very similar situation. Compared to big fight scenarios, I don't think that he was quite as experienced. Does that mean that I believe that Canelo is an all-around greater or better fighter than Floyd Mayweather Jr.? No, I don't. You know, I think that Floyd is the greater and more skilled fighter, you know, when you talk about peak v peak. But at the end of the day, what these channels are trying to make you believe is that Canelo Alvarez was that, you know, he's just this guy that has never adjusted his game or never gotten better in terms of his skill set for the past several years. And that he's just a complete same fighter as what he, you know, when he lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr., you know, and I just don't think that that's the case. It is what it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for this video. I don't think that there's really much more else to review. But I would actually like to have Johnboxing pound for pound the best one day on my channel for a live debate. I would like to see it, you know, but we'll see. For any of you guys that are interested, you certainly could ask his channel. I asked him, I believe, once upon a time in his comment section. I, of course, did not get a response, but we'll see what ends up happening because, of course, I'm always very respectful, you know, and always willing to hear different sides of opinion during a debate, you know, but I would like to see. And, of course, you know, also inviting Mr. Sean Newton or Sean Unboxing, you know, that one channel who I believe has commentated actually quite a few times on my channel. Also, you know, inviting him for a potential live debate as well. So we'll see. I might do one soon. But we'll see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.